question. So as a heads up, folks, we are recording this first hour, and then the breakout rooms afterwards, that half an hour, that won't be recorded. So if you have like some more personal questions that you don't want to have recorded, feel free to ask those questions in the breakout rooms. Uh, Hello, I'm Jesse Bloom Bateman. I'm faculty at SUNY Cortland in the Biological Sciences Department. I'm also the chair of the Biogeosciences section's DEI committee, putting on this series of workshops trying to get out more information about career paths outside of the university. I know a lot of your professors, myself included, can pretty much only tell you about how to go into academia because that's where our careers took us. And we've had a bunch of great conversations so far, and I'm really excited for this conversation coming up about the private sector. And so gonna allow our panelists to introduce themselves. Uh, as a heads up for your introduction, if you could please tell us who you are, what organization you're coming from, and then what your favorite piece of science trivia currently is. Uh, and so who would like to start us off?
I can start. Melissa Warren. I'm with Jacobs Engineering, and I already forgot what else you wanted me to say. I'm a project manager, and I also work as a technologist, so I'm a biogeochemist as well. Split my time 50-50 between those tasks. And then my favorite piece of science, okay, since I'm going to Disney soon, I would say it would have to be some Star Wars trivia.
So what do you have a piece of science, Star Wars science trivia?
Off the top of my head, no. Let's
Okay.
see. Okay, I'll come up with something later.
All right. And then Spencer, do you want to jump in next?
Sure. Sorry. Yeah, so I'm Spencer Washburn. I'm a scientist at Geosyntech Consultants. I've been here for a little over 2 years now. My favorite piece of science trivia is, I don't know, I have a lot about Mercury. Mercury was what I studied in school, but I think probably my favorite one is we had less mercury in our lab in graduate school than you would consume by eating a tuna steak.
And that was like what y'all were studying. That's impressive.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Laura, do you want to go next?
Sure. My name's Laura Hess. I work at Bayer Crop Science. Folks may know Bayer from like aspirin. A lot of people don't know that we have a big crop science and agriculture division, or maybe you do if you've seen the news about all the glyphosate litigation, super fun. But anyway, let's see my favorite piece of science trivia. I was reading a book with my kids last night about weather, and one of the sections was about snow. And it reminded us that no two snowflakes are the same. So I thought that was a sweet, gentle piece of trivia.
And at least for some of us, a pertinent one coming up. Northeast, I had our first snowfall a couple days ago. All right, and then Yoichi, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Yoichi Shiga. Yeah, I work at Wells Fargo on the enterprise sustainability team. I've been there for about 3 years. I'm based in San Francisco. Yeah, I didn't have any science trivia, so I had to look up. So I had to look up like an old tweet from Ken Caldera where he posted like the amount of like concrete that the world produces is basically like the equivalent of like every person every day in a year, like producing 25 pounds of concrete. So like that's what the world produces in mass, which is insane because there's like billions of people on this planet. But yeah.
What other? I guess I'm kind of surprised by that because like volume wise, that's not a lot of concrete per person. It's so dense. Yeah. All right, thank you all. I feel like I stepped up the difficulty when I changed it from like what is your favorite ice cream flavor to what is like a bit of science trivia. All right, so softball question coming out of the gate is gonna be, so you introduced where you're coming from, but like, do you go into a little bit about what your day to day is like for your job? You know, like how you're generally spending your time, if you could. And I'll let you all decide who goes first.
I could go first because I went last time. So yeah, my day to day is very different than from when I was back in academia. I'd say I have like a quarter of my day with like meetings with various folks within my team or within the bank. We work across the entire organization, and so I don't know. I mean, probably folks don't know like how a bank works, but Wells Fargo is a giant bank, and so there's these different sort of segments and sectors, and we're involved with, or my role specifically is involved with trying to just better understand what the financing that we're doing that's like quote unquote sustainable financing. So, you know, I call it like the business of sustainability or the business of net zero. And so sometimes that's working with folks that are like actual bankers. Sometimes I was working with like data and technology folks. And so the other part of my day is spent doing kind of like light, I would say technical work. So just trying to understand systems. I do very minimal coding, maybe just some SQL. And then we do a lot of sort of like education slash like consulting within the bank. And so that's just like, again, this is for like a pretty general broad audience primarily. And so it's like distilling things that are related to, you know, again, like the basic types of things that need to get financed to move us into like the new energy economy. And so if there are really deep dives, we'll spend some time doing that. But primarily it's like general, like consolidating technical information to like a general audience.
And if I can follow up with a question, Yuichi, is that like what the bank should invest the money from deposits into, or is it more of like when or not they'll give loans and things?
Yeah,
And is
so
it probably a very naive question?
yeah, no. It's like when I started working at the bank, I didn't really know that much about finance at all. And so Wells Fargo and a lot of large banks set sort of targets or goals for how much sustainable finance they want to deploy by some certain date. So Wells Fargo set a goal of $500 billion in sustainable finance by 2030. And so that's everything at a bank like Wells Fargo from like, you know, an EV car loan for like a, you know, for you or me. It could also be loans financing to EV manufacturers. It could be, you know, leases for like, think of Disney, leases for big companies for their, you know, their tour buses or you know, the buses that, or the, you know, the equipment they use to get around their facilities. It could be like for a municipal, you know, like it's everything, municipal finance. So like when you think of like, you know, oh, you know, some city is, you know, raising money to install LEDs, you know, throughout the city. So it's municipal bonds. It's like a pretty very wide range of things, and it is kind of like the entire economy. So most of the stuff that we need to do to get to sort of net zero is requires financing of some degree. And so yeah, it touches lots of different sectors and things.
Thank you. Who'd like to go
I
next?
can go next. Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
Okay, I can go. So my day-to-day is completely different based on the day. So I'll give you a couple different examples of how my day-to-day could look. So just as a background of what I do, our main goal is to clean up the environmental messes of oil companies, mining companies, or industrial sites. So that's basically making sure that the groundwater is clean of carcinogens before it gets to a drinking water source. And so as a project manager, my day-to-day could be working on finances to make sure that our budget is in order to be able to get our tasks completed within our scope and within our client's budget. As a project manager, my day-to-day could also look like writing emails or making phone calls so that we can get field staff out into the field, collect samples per our scopes of work, send them to a laboratory, and make sure that all of our data is coming in so that we can process it and eventually write reports, which eventually I'll then review and submit to our clients or submit to our regulatory agencies, such as, for example, EPA, we have South Carolina Department of Environmental Services, or Alabama departments. It just really depends on the project. I work statewide and Puerto Rico as well. So that's project manager. Oh, anything else to say about project management?
Melissa,
A lot of emails.
sorry to cut in. I know you're only halfway through. Apparently folks are getting scratching sounds when you're speaking. Do you have the mic near your like your hair or something? Or
No, I actually have the compute. What if I talk a little bit lower?
let's see. Let's give it a shot.
Okay, how about now if I'm talking a little bit lower about my next role of technologist? Okay.
Yep.
So I also work as a technologist, and that means that whenever we're getting our data in, and it depends on the data that we're getting. Sometimes I work with compound specific isotope analysis. Sometimes I work with groundwater data that comes in with contaminants of interest. And I'll take that data and I'll look at it and I'll say, okay, we need to get more data here. We need to run this study, or we need to get this person involved to understand what we're looking at. The next part of my day-to-day could be at the airport. I spend a decent amount of time at the airport going from one meeting to the next, or I could be going into the field where I need to conduct a site walk, or maybe I need to do some sort of subcontractor oversight when there's a specific type of sampling that needs to be done. So that could be my day-to-day. It all ranges. And I would say that I don't work a specific 9 to 5, and that's for my benefit. They still hear everything scratching? Oh no, I'm sorry. Maybe somebody else can go and I can see if I can figure out what's wrong with my microphone.
Yeah. One thing, if you could check, might be that it's the sensitivity is a little high and it's picking some stuff up.
Okay, let me look at that while somebody else goes.
Thank you. All right, Laura, do you want to hop in?
Yeah, I can jump in. So like I mentioned before, I work for Bayer Crop Science. So our traditional business is seeds and crop protection, like pesticides. But I actually work in the data science, or what we call the digital farming branch of the company. So we started out as a startup, and then we were acquired a couple times, and now are part of Bayer. So I'm a science director there. I work entirely on our sustainability programs. So both our internal programs to meet our corporate sustainability commitments. But I actually spend most of my time helping develop the Bayer Carbon Program, which is a suite of new business models that we've launched to help farmers and our company profit from helping farmers adopt regenerative agricultural practices like cover crops and no-till, reducing nitrogen fertilizer, etc. We have a footprint on 4 continents at this point. And I work a lot on science strategy, as well as coaching our science teams. So these are mostly data scientists, remote sensing scientists, data engineers. And I spend pretty much all day in meetings at this point. I used to be a data scientist, and I used to do a lot of like hand keyboard coding work in Python, data analysis and modeling. When I joined the company about 8 years ago, so I joined straight out of my PhD, which is where I had the distinct pleasure of knowing Jesse and Yoichi. But yeah, most of my time now is in meetings, and I really try to balance that for my sanity. I also spend a fair bit of time traveling because we have teams all over the country and all over the world.
Thank you, Laura. So a quick question on that. So you said that did you start with the company when it was still a startup, or had you come in after acquisition?
We had been acquired once at that point, and then we were acquired by Bayer once. So we were kind of in like transition mode already, sort of transitioning from startup mode to like being part of a bigger company. But now we're like very much a part of like big Bayer.
And if you could, like, could you elaborate on like, and because I'm assuming, I don't have any insight on this, so hopefully it'll be helpful for others as well. Like, how much does acquisition change sort of what you do? Or is it more of like, well, the top sort of changes, but we keep moving in the same direction?
That's a really good question. I think like it's changed some things for the better. And some things, so we're actually this year undergoing this huge like bureaucracy slashing process. I think a lot of big companies are. So, I think, yeah, like downsides of being acquired by a big company are like, more bureaucracy, like, but yeah, some of the positive things, for me, what attracted me to private industry, coming out of my PhD was just the impact that I could have. I had sort of like two offers on the table when I was finishing my PhD. One was doing a postdoc and one was joining, so Climate was the name of is the name of the company still. And like, to me, just the ability, like the fact that I get to work on sustainability programs, like across North America, Latin America, like Asia Pacific and Europe, and like influence farming practices across all those regions. Like, to me, that's super exciting. And so, I think being a part of Bayer has just sort of expanded the reach of our organization. And so, to me, that's exciting.
Thank you. And also, as a state employee, I bet private industry doesn't touch our level of bureaucracy.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Spencer, would you like to chime in?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I'm a environmental consultant, which means much like Melissa, I rarely have the same day twice, which is part of what sort of attracted me to the field to begin with. For example, for the last week, the last 5 days until about an hour ago, I was in the field in northern Minnesota installing flumes at a client site where we're trying to understand geochemistry of mine waste rock, releasing sulfate. And so that's a study where, I was involved from the what are we going to study? How are we going to study it? How are we going to convince the client that it's worthwhile, to the actual, let's go manually put a flume in the ground. So I think that's a good sort of like miniature picture of what a day looks like. I often will spend some amount of time on different projects at different stages on sort of those things. I also still get to be involved in research to a degree. We often partner with academics, and try and provide that bridge between academics and industry, or provide folks in academia the sort of perspective of, often it's related to new technologies and how they would be or could be used, what the needs are in sort of real client spaces. So there's a fair amount of that. I probably spend between a quarter and a tenth of every day in meetings. Those either are internal meetings, oftentimes for projects, but also external meetings with clients or with regulators, again, much like Melissa. Yeah, so fair amount of those things. Probably spend, I don't know, in any given month, maybe a tenth or a quarter of my time in the field at project sites. And then the rest of the time is at an office desk, writing reports, sending emails, doing all the things you most folks do. So
Thank you, Spencer. Melissa, do you want to see how your sound is / finish up what you're trying to say?
Sure. Well, I heard it's whenever I make an S sound, so maybe that's my speech, or it could be the audio in the room. Sorry about that. Is it any better?
Still getting some scratching,
Hmm.
but I think we can
I think you're okay.
carry on. Yeah, it'll be
just
fine.
go for it.
Okay, so the last part I was going to say is that I don't work a typical 9 to 5. I would say that that's one of the things that I love about my job is that if I wake up with an idea in my mind, sometimes this happens at 4 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning, I can jump in and I can start logging my time, getting my work done between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. And then maybe I can go on a jog and come back and get some more work done online, something like that. But that was the last part I was going to say about my day to day, is that it's not 9 to 5. It's really whenever I get my job done.
So really enjoy that flexibility
Mhm.
of so follow up, and Kat, I'm going to kind of hijack your question. So Kat was asking, what did you study in college, and did you feel like you needed an advanced degree to get into your current job? And I'd like to add a little bit onto that of like, where do you feel like the skills you developed your uh, in your education really come through in your job? Uh, who'd like to start us? I can always pick if you prefer.
I can start again. Yeah, so I got a PhD in civil and environmental engineering, but my research focus was on inverse modeling and tracking carbon dioxide emissions. I'd say I like maybe, I don't know. I did not have like a traditional career path or like plan, I would say. So it wasn't like I was like, oh, this is the step to get to working at Wells Fargo. When I had the sort of when I made my career change, I was just looking for something new and for something different and didn't quite know what it was. And I think it took me to getting into my current role to realize, I think, the variety of skills that I feel like I picked up along my route through a PhD. And not only the time, like actually doing the work that you need to do to get your PhD, but I was in like some organizations and, I went to conferences, like all of the other kind of stuff you kind of pick up along the way as part of the PhD were super useful. And so like things like, writing, being able to write like journal articles, but like write in a way that's, whatever that skill is, whatever that you needed to do for your specific writing field, I think is can be applied other places. Making PowerPoint presentations and like figures, being able to like get visual information across. And then, yeah, like presenting in conferences where, like at AG, you got 12 minutes, like being able to like boil down complex ideas into like small tasks. But then like, I feel like the whole variety of things like mentoring, when I'm working with junior or other employees, being able to like use that sort of skill set. And then also, I think like, I don't know, at the time, like when you start off in your PhD, you're around people who are very senior, a lot of academics who are at the top of their field have been doing it probably longer than most people in industry have been, like the most senior people in industry. And so just getting comfortable working across, usually at least in my field, like that spectrum was more in my head of like someone who was very senior, like the senior folks were easier to talk to. But I think that comfort of just being able to talk through different levels of a perceived, I guess, hierarchy and knowledge, I think was also useful. Just being able to like be in a room and say like, ask a question, like what is this person talking about? And like being confident and being able to, sort of yeah, I think like my PhD, the most useful thing is that like people then think, oh, okay, he has a PhD, so he probably knows something. So it's okay for him to ask these like quote unquote stupid questions. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna add to that. I think Yoichi, like learning how to learn, I think is something I learned how to do in my PhD. Like, when you do a dissertation, I mean, yeah, you might come in with some base knowledge, but you really have to become an expert in a field that you were not an expert in before. And so I think that's something that I've used a lot in my career is sort of saying like, okay, I don't know anything about this, but like I'm just gonna like dive in and I'm gonna start like, doing internet searches and like talking to people who do know about it and like reading papers and so I think that like that piece and like the critical thinking piece too, I think is something I definitely developed in grad school that's been really useful in my career. One other thing, like another skill that I think I sort of picked up in grad school, but like not enough was coding, like programming. So like I knew how to like code very basically in graduate school, but honestly, my skills were like pretty terrible when I joined my company. And like what I've found is that, you know, kind of the industry standard for like data analysis and data science work is code. It's like, you know, R, Python. And so I really picked that up in my first year on the job, and my company, you know, that was something, yeah, that I learned while I was there.
Yeah, I'd follow up on both what Yoichi and Laura said. I think there are a lot of soft skills that you learn in a graduate school program that are really widely transferable that you don't really realize at the time are widely transferable. There's things like technical writing, which is like a skill everyone practices a lot, but like you don't really realize you've sort of done it. There's a lot of like the sort of mentoring aspects of like working with undergraduates, or even just like the sort of leading projects in small teams, right? Because you're working in a graduate student lab group or with your advisor and someone else kind of thing. So a lot of those like soft skills that you've practiced in grad school end up being very useful in whatever field you transition into. I think the question was also sort of like, what did you need like a higher degree to succeed in your field, right? Not at all. The company I work for and environmental consulting in general, sort of like there are many places to enter into the field, whether that's with an undergraduate degree or an advanced degree, and they're the opportunities that those folks are presented with are very similar, right? Like the career path is very similar. You just sort of enter it at different stages per se. So
I agree with everything everyone said. I would say knowing how to ask questions and being efficient and a self-starter in grad school is what really helped me with my career. And then I'll also touch on the having advanced career. I think in my company, I think it's really helped a lot to have an advanced career degree because of the technical writing skill. I started my career off in the field, and as I started writing reports, they were like, "Oh, you can do technical writing." And I said, "Yes." So I started doing a lot more reports, and I felt like my career was able to advance faster with that advanced degree in my belt.
Thank you all. And I think loving chat. Chat's just like making my job easy because they're asking great follow-up questions that also kind of align with some of those reflection questions. So sort of building on that, and Laura, you touched on this a little about like your coding skills and getting that help developing them. But I'm wondering if you could talk some about what mentorship looks like in your companies, or if you know, like more broadly in your sector, um, especially for like that transition from academia into your jobs, right? Like, are they kind of expecting you to have certain things, or is it like, we just need you to have that critical thinking and maybe some data processing, and we'll teach you everything else? Spencer, you want to start us off on this one?
sure. As far as skill set, I think with at least within my company, there is some expectation of a base skill set that you would get in undergraduate, and then any additional specialized technical skills you have on top of that simply open more doors for you to be involved in different projects, to work for different clients. So I wouldn't put it as like um, it's a barrier necessarily. It's more just like you start, as sort of Melissa was saying, like on a higher rung of possibilities. Um, but on the other hand, right, like there's also the expectation that not everyone knows everything. And so if there's a project need, there is typically time and space given for you to develop those skills as needed, especially technical skills, or to teach yourself technical skills. I think there's a certain expectation that like if you don't know something, like you'll be clear about that, but there's also an expectation that at some point you will spend the time to develop that skill set if it's necessary. As far as the mentoring goes, least within Geosyntech, there's both formal and informal mentoring. A lot of that has to do with your hiring process. Like you get assigned both like a supervisor per se, but also someone who is not your supervisor and not in your supervisory chain, who's like your integration coordinator, and that's sort of like your first mentor. And then there's also like more formal mentoring, and I think again, a lot of this sort of comes at what stage in your career you're entering in. But yeah, I've found mentoring to be pretty easy, both as a mentor and being a mentee, in terms of finding folks who are interested in providing that support. I think I hit on the two main questions. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I believe so. Thank you. Someone like to follow up on that, or
I'll follow up on that one since we're both in the same consulting realm. So I would say with Jacobs, I have had more mentors than I can even list right now. And I think as long as you have the willingness to learn and you find somebody in a senior role or they find you, as long as you show that you're willing to learn and you're willing to do the job properly, they are more than happy to help out. And there's a saying at our company, really just ask questions early and often. And throughout my career, I have met so many people who are just so willing to help and make sure that I succeed. So that's a plus.
thank you, Melissa. Laura Yuichi, or do you feel pretty similar for your experiences as well?
Yeah, I think I've benefited from some really wonderful managers who really guided me along different stages in my career. I found, within my I mean, I've only worked at one company, so I don't have a ton of basis for comparison, but it's really a focus. I think in academia, it's not, I think professors they're not always necessarily focused on mentoring. But within my company, I found that like managers are like trained to like be able to support their people. Because like they want their people to be successful so that the company can be successful. So
Yeah, one of the and then maybe this is probably not specific to Wells Fargo, but I think is a private sector terminology that I've been hearing is like rather than just having a mentor, is also like focusing on fostering like a sponsor or like people who will act not necessarily as someone who's going to like give you direct feedback, but like almost like vouch for you at a higher level. Sort of yeah, I don't know quite what the interaction is, but that's been a new term that I hadn't really been aware of. And so that doesn't have to necessarily be within your company, but someone, again, who's at like a more senior level that you're connected with, maybe through a sponsor, just to get awareness of like what your abilities are. And I feel like, again, in academia, this kind of happens more naturally because you have, you have people that more senior that you're working with, or maybe they read your paper or whatever. And so like, there's like other ways for that to kind of more naturally occur. People kind of hear of you, but in industry, that may not necessarily happen. And so you have to be a bit more proactive about, finding those people and almost like letting them know who you are. It's a kind of a strange interaction, and it wasn't natural for me, but I think that's also been important.
So for the sponsor, you'd be like kind of like your cheering section within the industry. Like, yeah, this person's great.
Exactly.
All right. So talked some about being in the job. I see some other question about being in the job, but I also want to make sure we touch on, because this is like career pathways, strategies or ideas of getting into positions. And so Patrick was asking, like, did networking at a conference like AGU help you find your current job? If so, how did you approach that networking? I think broadly think about this, like, how does someone, either a student or a postdoc or a junior faculty member, like make that connection or get their foot in the door at a private business? Is it just like cold call, or?
Oh, I can go on that one. So what I did is I went through LinkedIn and I would message any of the Georgia Tech alumni that worked at some of the companies that I was interested in working at. And whoever messaged me back, I was like, okay, this person is willing to answer some questions. So I asked them multiple questions, asked if they wanted to meet for lunch, tell me some more about their job. And eventually it was one of the people that I reached out to for lunch and to ask questions that eventually was my connection to getting my job at Jacobs, Georgia Tech alumni as well.
Thank you.
I can go. I don't have a lot of like really great advice on this. I sort of stumbled backwards into this job. Um, and I actually got reached out to rather than doing the reaching out. But again, I was using the networks that were already there for me in academia. So I was contacted about this position by someone who was in the same lab group as someone who had been in the postdoc at Oak Ridge National Lab in the same group prior to me. So like we knew each other tenuously and they knew each other from grad school. And so it was a networking thing. But as far as like would something like AGU or another conference work, I would say that at least from my experience, like a lot of like your smaller local conferences will often have a pretty good presence of folks in sort of the larger environmental sphere. Like we go to a lot of local conferences here, just because we're interested in the technical presentations that are being given, but also to network. And so one potential way to reach out if your sort of like current network doesn't have a lot of those outside connections would be some of the smaller local conferences like will often have a lot of folks in the sort of like environmental sphere who are interested in recruiting, but also, you know, have that technical skill set so that you can sort of open the door that way.
And Spencer, would you say that the smaller conferences are better for that than like large national conferences, or just where you happen to end up going?
I don't want to make a value judgment on better or worse. I just think that like sometimes some of the smaller stuff it's easier to get to someone who's going to like remember your name and remember your face, and if you hand them your resume or whatever, like they're going to, you know, you're likely to get a touch point again after that. At least as sort of a firm, we've often found that like some of the smaller conferences like you just better you're better able to get a sense of the candidate, and so it's more productive for us, right? And from a recruiting standpoint, like when we go out and recruit, we're like more interested in going to some of the local stuff than some of those larger conferences, just because we feel like we end up with better folks and better connections that way.
Thanks.
At,
Sorry. I wasn't trying to make like a value judgment, more of just like thinking like we're always often like really focused on like, oh, making sure you go to the national conference because it's the bigger thing. And sometimes people forget like, oh, there's, you know, like regional
yeah,
ESA meetings, there's regional smaller, like very specific to a similar, like a single issue meetings, and like that you should be taking advantage of those, and you can make great networks there.
yep, yeah, and that's sort of the level I'm talking at, is like the regional scale, like, you know, upper Midwest CTAC kind of thing, like that sort of scale is what I'm talking about. So it can still be a national organization. It's just like
Mhm.
a meeting where there aren't like 20,000 people.
Yeah.
I
AGU fall meeting, huge.
I found conferences helpful for networking within academia. So like I remember I was, exploring some like postdoc opportunities through like folks that I met at conferences. Maybe I gave a talk and they were like, oh, we saw your talk, like let's talk more. I don't know that conferences are the right place to network for industry. I mean, I think there is some industry presence at conferences, but it's going to be a lot less than academic presence. So, I mean, I think like using like your network of like your friends and your like former colleagues and former classmates, I like personally, I think that might be a more effective. That's how I found my current job, was through like a former friend and classmate who worked at the company, and he was like, hey, this job like is open, I think you should apply. But also, I mean, like, when I was hiring, we would get like hundreds of resumes, and and people would message me on LinkedIn and stuff, and that I sort of feel like that's helpful only up to a point. Like I think, just having a really standout resume at the end of the day is kind of what's going to get you an interview with the recruiter. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
So, Laura, are you saying that like networking gets you to a point, but really you just have to put in the time and effort to make sure you're a good candidate on paper?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think networking helps for sure. I wouldn't say like go to conferences to like find networking opportunities to get into industry.
Cool. Thank you.
There's two things that I want to point out is that with some of these companies, there's usually some sort of incentive as well to get somebody hired on. And so if you do find a person who's really interested in looking at your resume and talking to you, they have an incentive. It's probably maybe a couple $100s or something like that. But if they see that you are a good candidate, they're going to reach out to that hiring manager and they're going to say, hey, take a look at this resume. We think they could be a good fit. What do you think? And then the other item I want to point out is that your interview skills. Interview skills show that you put preparation into what you want. And so if you interview well, they're going to say, okay, this person prepared, they're ready for this job. Let's give them the job.
Yeah, one thing I'll mention is just and I don't know if others had done this and they haven't discussed, but after I decided I was going to go into private industry, I actually enrolled in one of these data science boot camps. And so that was a like formal way where they like actually have like companies that are like tied to the boot camp and they kind of bring you in. And so like, that cost money, but it was an investment, but like, and I actually didn't get a job through that, but like it did give me like that exposure. And so I did kind of what others folks, mentioned here, just sort of reached out to friends who had made the leap into industry and like kept a pretty broad, like even friends outside of that, just like anyone I knew who was like in a adjacent, field, to sort of like get that initial interview. Because I do think that, or at least at the time, it was just tough to get into any interview, especially coming from a PhD where you don't have any quote unquote real world experience, but you don't have that like first private sector job on your resume. I think that was, or it felt like that was kind of a barrier for some places. So
Thank you all for that. And so this
Can I
next
add
question.
one more
Sure,
thing?
go ahead, Melissa.
So in consulting, if you go into environmental consulting, more than likely you're going to have to get a few certifications. One of the certifications, I'll start by saying I was targeting 3 different companies when I graduated. I wanted one of those 3 different companies. And so I noticed a certification that kept repeating itself on every single application, and that was 40-hour HAZWOPER. And so I'm not saying anybody needs to do this, but I decided that I was going to purchase 40-hour HAZWOPER, go ahead and do my 40-hour HAZWOPER, and then I put that on my resume. And then one of the things that was pointed out to me during my interview was, hey, how do you already have 40-hour HAZWOPER? And I said, well, I went ahead and took it because I saw that it was, a certification at the bottom of the application. And they said, well, that's really impressive that you already took the time to do that. I will point out that companies usually pay for the certification for you right after you're hired so that you can go into the field. But it's just taking the initiative is probably more impressive to hiring managers.
And Melissa, thank you. That leads us right into the next question that I had for y'all. Again, stolen from the chat because y'all are awesome. It's like making that standout resume, or also just like increasing your chances of either having that lucky interaction or like getting your resume to the top. Are there certifications or trainings that when you see them either in your new hires or if you're hiring in resumes, you're like, oh yeah, like this is something that we'll definitely take a second look at when we see it?
For Jacobs, I would say it's the 40-hour training. So the required trainings would be the 40-hour house swapper, every now and then 10-hour construction, first aid, CPR, for AED. And I think those are the major ones that we require on all projects. And then every training after that is just site specific.
And then for the other three, are there things like, oh, we love it when we see someone comes in with like a data science or a data analysis boot camp or something like that?
So I
I'll-
would say, oh, go ahead, Spencer.
No, that's okay. I'd say two things. The first is when we're reviewing resumes, one of the things that always helps candidates stand out is if they've done research. Just because we found that like, and again, this is, I guess, is more for undergraduates than for PhD students. Like everyone assumes you've done research if you've been a PhD student, but as an undergrad, like if you've been involved in a lab or like done a project, even if it doesn't rise to the level of like a senior thesis, you know, or capstone or whatever it's called at your school project, like if you're volunteering 10 hours a week in somebody's lab, like that experience can be really helpful in sort of like getting you introduced to more concepts and more projects. And so that's one that always stands out on resumes. I'd say that the other one that really stands out is if you have a coding skill set, right? R, Python, SQL, like whatever it be, provide something more like demonstrative on your resume than like I am proficient in, right? Like give me in a like a concrete example of what you have used that language to do or to produce. And that stands out a lot more than like languages I'm proficient in block that lists like 6 languages. And I'm like, do you really know all of these proficiently enough? And that may be what Laura was about to jump in on.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. So like, you know, meeting basic job requirements is, I mean, it sounds really obvious, but so yeah, like for data science, like coding, data analysis, modeling, and then exactly what Spencer said, like demonstrating that you have like applied experience with those things. So like to me, having like Spencer mentioned, you know, like having done like research or an internship or something is much more powerful than like saying you've done a boot camp. Yeah, like to me, it's really like if someone lists like, you know, when they say like what, you know, tools they're proficient in, they list like 15 different things. Like, I'm just like, I know, like, you know, so I think like actually like being like clear on your resume about what your skills actually are. And then I think also, and this probably goes to what I was saying before, like just being succinct in your like having a succinct and readable resume. You'd be surprised like how many resumes are not, so.
And then, so follow up on that, Laura, you were saying like meeting the qualifications for the role. On, I know like at least in academia, oftentimes we'll have like advisees who come in like, well, I don't fully meet everything they say they're looking for. And we're always still just like, no, apply for it. Like in academia, we give vague directions. And so get in there, and if they like you, they like you. Is it different in private industry? Like, well, we're really looking to fulfill these things. And if you don't, even if you're great, we're not going to give you a shot, or like,
I mean, I can't speak to like every industry and every company. I can really just speak to my own. But I mean, yeah, like for us, when we post a job, like the basic qualifications are like, I think there's like legally, like the applicants have to meet those. And like there's some wiggle room, right? Like, you know, it's yeah, I mean, I agree with your approach, Jesse. Like I would much rather people apply and like, you know, go for it. Because yeah, especially with you know, there's like research showing that like women are less likely to apply for jobs, you know, if they don't meet all the requirements, whereas like, you know, men are more likely to do that, and that's led to gender gap. So yeah, I'd say, you know, apply, like don't not apply. But you know, if you want to like really increase your chances, you know, if the job is if it's a data science position and you've like never done any data analysis, like I think you're probably wasting your time.
thank you for that follow up.
Yeah, and then just to chime in there and kind of like looping back to what Melissa had already said, feel like the informational interviews, if you can get one of those in before you either apply or before you go in for the interview, is also super helpful. So then you actually know more about that specific role. And so that usually gives you a better idea of like what is going to be asked for. And then, you could either tailor your resume or just like tailor your interview on like what's actually required in the job. Because I feel like most job postings don't actually tell you what you're going to do in the job. They're just like lists of things, but like it's good to be able to talk to someone and actually figure out what it is the job is actually doing.
And I think informational interviews is across all sectors something that everyone expects people to send emails asking for some time. As long as you're reasonable in your request, most people are happy to provide that, give a little feedback, because also like it helps the person in the position too, like, hey, maybe I want to recruit this person later. Maybe like faculty member want to recruit this person to my lab. For you all, probably also potential ways of recruiting people into your business. So to transition slightly and actually kind of get more specific, we've been talking broadly about all candidates and like ways that everyone can help themselves. Uh, because we've largely focused on US based sectors or US based companies and for our federal, like the US federal, there have been a lot of questions from non-citizens and about like how do we get into these spaces? Like it's really hard to get into a federal contractor or federal positions if you're not a citizen. Do you have similar barriers, different barriers? If you could speak to that, it would be really appreciated.
So I'm a citizen, but a US citizen, but I have hired people who are not. And so our company does sponsor people for visas and green cards. So I think it's not yeah, like we absolutely, I think we need folks to have like some visa that they can kind of get them in the door. And then if there's like extensions needed, then we help with that.
Yeah, and sorry, poorly worded on my part. For if you all have hired non-citizens or when you're engaging with non-citizen applicants, how do you work with that? Yeah.
We also hire those who require a visa. I think oftentimes, whether right or wrong, that often needs to come with like a pretty clear fit. We sometimes hire where we're sort of like, we're looking for someone who's great. And oftentimes, if there's going to be that level of commitment, it is we need X person with Y skill set, and X person can be whoever if they have Y skill set. Right. So we're sort of agnostic about position as long as you have Y skill set. And so I guess my advice would be like, if you have a strong skill set in something, whatever that be, being tailoring your resume to be really clear about like, here are my strengths in that skill set.
Thank you. Melissa, Yuichi, is that similar or do you not have hiring interactions? So
I don't have any knowledge on this subject, unfortunately.
Yeah, same. I don't do much hiring.
All right. Well, thank you, Laura and Spencer, for your input. So I think a few more minutes. So a question that has come up, it's been an election year, and for federal and federal contractors, pretty obvious of like there is a big impact of political elections on their workplace. Some of you, I think, have been through a couple election cycles at your positions, and does in your positions have political elections had much impact on your either day to day or your overall like your group's direction?
I can take this one. I would say No, not to the degree that you would expect as a federal employee. Both of my postdocs, I was technically a pseudo federal employee. And so like for the 2018 shutdown, right? Like I couldn't go into the lab for 6 weeks of my postdoc, which is a huge amount of time when you're on a 2-year postdoc. And like my current position has none of those like barriers where like the direction of the political winds can really interrupt or disrupt what you're doing from a technical standpoint. I think the one space where it does sort of matter per se is at like a specific project level, and a lot of that is regulatory driven, right? Like we often are working for or with clients who have to interact with regulators, whether that be on a site cleanup or compliance role or like whatever that may be. We also do work for regulatory agencies as sort of a scientific technical consultant. And so at a project level, so sort of on a day-to-day level, it can change the direction of a project, but not in the sense of like my entire job is no longer what I thought it was.
Luigi or Melissa, did you have any or?
Yeah, I was gonna say it's somewhat similar in the financial industry. There's a lot of the um, you know, it's more of just like the broader regulatory environment. That's what affects it. And there are a lot of things that are in certain bills that are pro, like these tax credit kind of based incentives. And so it's sort of like immediately those aren't going to change, but obviously there's implications if they're going to change. But I wouldn't say it's like a flip of a switch. And we're not like technically, it's not like back when I was working, where like, yeah, the government shutdowns would really like make it so like those folks would like not be able to access their email addresses and stuff like that. So not in that thing.
Much more insulated from changes, political changes. Cool. All right, so to give ourselves an hour before gonna cut in last question. So if you could go back and so actually instead of going back in time to when you were leaving school or about to get into your current position, bring that person to this day and age, because it might have changed some over the past however many years since you got in. So like if today you're giving advice to a younger version of yourself who wanted to end up where you're at, what would that piece of advice be?
Learn how to code better. But that's just me.
Yeah.
I probably would have taken some more financial classes to be able to get I'm forgetting the name of the role right now. It'll come to me in a second, but it's a certification to be able to do finances. And I would have just taken probably 6 extra credit hours so that I could get and let me find it for you all. Go ahead.
So more coding skill, more financial skill.
I have two. The first is practical, and the second is perhaps more personal. Echoing Laura, I would have taken a coding class as a graduate student or a GIS class. I think those are the two things that I interact with on a really frequent basis and have basically had to take like the hard way of like, banging your head against the wall until you figure it out for yourself, rather than like simply sitting in on a class. So that's the practical suggestion. I think the more personal suggestion is I spent a lot of time thinking that I wanted a career in academia, because I thought it was the only path. It felt like the only path to be interactive in research, like actually doing research and working with new data and like thinking about new questions. And it took me a really long time to figure out that there are fields and places and spaces where you can touch research and be involved in research that are not academia. And so I think I would tell younger Spencer that, right? Like, what about the research, or like, what about academia is like really engaging, and what parts do you like? And like, there are places you can find that outside of academia as well.
Yeah, my is actually kind of, my advice is sort of similar. Like, take some time to think about the actual things that I enjoy doing. And I think within my career, identify those. And I don't know why it took me so long to actually like sit down and think about those, or like rather than just kind of churn on and head to the next step. So I think that kind of take a pause. And then more personally, also just to like be I think be more confident in with the skills that I actually had. I think that for some reason there was like a vibe, even in this data science boot camp, which was all PhD students, that like we somehow weren't able, it was going to be really hard for us to get jobs, but like you have advanced degrees. I don't know, you're very smart and capable, like you're going to get jobs. Like it's like yeah, it's going to be okay, kind of.
Thank you all. And thank you mostly. So the CPA, the certified personal accountant role.
Right, and that's when you start getting to the executive level positions. If you decided to go that non-technical route and you wanted to go advance in project management, program management, and eventually to your vice president levels, that taking courses to eventually be able to get that certificate is definitely helpful.
Thank you all. Can we give everyone, all of our panelists, a round of applause, either using your React, or if you want to turn on your video and clap it out for them. Thank you all for all of your wonderful advice and your anecdotes. At this time, I'm going to stop the recording. Hopefully I can do this. And yes.